Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through Norse myths and quiet history. Dim your lights. Settle under your blanket. Let the noise of the day fade away. And if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. The old stories call to us from across centuries, whispering of gods who walked between worlds, of wisdom earned through sacrifice, and of quiet moments that shaped the fate of all 9 realms. These aren't tales of thunder and lightning, though those exist too. These are the gentle spaces between the storms, the thoughtful pauses that reveal who these ancient beings really were. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Whether it's midnight in Minneapolis or dawn breaking in Dublin, we're all gathered here in this peaceful moment together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. You know how sometimes you catch your reflection in a window and pause, wondering what you'd be willing to give up for something you truly wanted? The Norse god Odin faced that same question, but his stakes were infinitely higher. Picture him standing at the edge of Mimir's well, the most sacred spring in all the 9 realms, knowing that the next few moments would change him forever. Odin wasn't always the one-eyed wanderer we know from the stories. Once upon a time, and isn't it strange how even god stories begin that way? He had 2 perfectly good eyes, sharp and blue as winter ice. He could see across vast distances, spot a raven's flight from miles away, and read the expressions on mortal faces far below in Midgard. But seeing and knowing are 2 different things entirely. The well sat quietly beneath one of Yggdrasil's massive roots, the world tree that connected all 9 realms like a cosmic highway. If you've ever sat beside a still pond on a windless day, you might imagine what Mimir's well looked like. Except this water held something far more precious than your reflection. Every drop contained wisdom gathered from the beginning of time, knowledge that flowed like underground rivers through the roots of existence itself. Mimir, the well's guardian, wasn't quite god and wasn't quite giant, but something in between, one of those ancient beings who existed before such distinctions mattered much. He had been watching over this well for so long that he'd become part of it, his consciousness flowing with the sacred waters, his memories mixing with the wisdom of ages. When he spoke, it was like hearing the voice of the earth itself, slow and deep and patient. Odin approached on foot, not riding his 8-legged horse Sleipnir, not accompanied by his wolves or ravens. This was a journey he needed to make alone, step by careful step. You can imagine the sound his boots made on the soft earth around the well, that gentle squelch of moss and fallen leaves, the kind of sound that seems too loud in a sacred place. The well's surface was so still, it looked like black glass. Ancient runes were carved into the stones that formed its rim, symbols so old that even Odin couldn't read them all. The water was impossibly clear, and yet it seemed to hold depths that went down not just into the earth, but into time itself. If you peered long enough, and Odin did, you might catch glimpses of things that were, things that are, and things that might yet come to pass. Mimir emerged from the water slowly, his form shifting between man and something more elemental. His hair flowed like seaweed, and his eyes held the patient gleam of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall like seasons. He studied Odin with the sort of careful attention you might give to a puzzle you're trying to solve. "All-Father," Mimir said, his voice carrying the echo of deep caves and underground streams. "You come seeking wisdom, but wisdom isn't free. Everything has a price, even for gods, especially for gods." Odin had expected this. He'd brought treasures with him, golden rings crafted by the finest smiths in Asgard, weapons that could cut through stone, knowledge of his own that might interest an ancient guardian. But Mimir shook his head at each offering, water dripping from his hair like falling stars. "Wisdom can't be bought with gold or steel," Mimir explained gently. "It can only be traded for something of equal value. What is wisdom worth to you, All-Father? What would you sacrifice to see clearly into the heart of things?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Odin found himself staring at his reflection in the well's surface, 2 eyes staring back, eyes that had seen much but understood less than he'd hoped. He thought about the responsibilities that weighed on his shoulders, the knowledge that Ragnarok, the end of all things, was coming someday. How could he protect his people, his realm, his family, without understanding the deeper patterns that moved beneath the surface of events? The decision, when it came, was swift and sure. Odin reached up and placed his fingers over his right eye, the eye that had watched sunrises over Asgard's golden halls, that had seen his son Balder's first steps, that had gazed upon the northern lights dancing across Midgard's skies. With one quick motion, he plucked it out. There was pain, of course. Sharp, and bright, and immediate. But there was also something else. Something that might have been relief. The eye fell into the well with barely a splash, sinking down through layers of wisdom water until it disappeared into the depths. As it fell, Odin felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. Mimir cupped water in his hands and offered it to Odin. It looked ordinary, just clear water that might have come from any mountain stream, but when Odin drank, the taste was indescribable. It was like swallowing starlight, like drinking the very essence of understanding. Knowledge flowed into him, not facts or figures, but deeper truths about the nature of sacrifice, the weight of leadership, the connections between all living things. He saw how every choice rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. He understood that sometimes the greatest strength comes from apparent weakness, that loss can be a form of gaining, that true sight has less to do with eyes and more to do with wisdom. The pain in his empty socket began to transform into something else. Not comfort, exactly, but a different kind of awareness. As Odin walked away from the well, one hand pressed to his wounded face, he found that his remaining eye saw more clearly than both eyes ever had. Colors seemed deeper, shadows held meaning, and the connections between things became visible like golden threads stretching across the cosmos. He had lost sight and gained vision, traded a part of himself for a deeper understanding of the whole. The journey back to Asgard was long and contemplative. Odin moved slowly, adjusting to his new way of seeing, learning to read the world with both his physical eye and his inner sight. Birds seemed to carry messages in their flight patterns. The wind spoke in languages he was just beginning to understand. Even the simple act of walking felt different, as if each step was part of a larger dance he could finally see. When he finally reached his halls, the other gods gathered around him with mixtures of concern and curiosity. They wanted to know what he had learned, what wisdom was worth such a price. But Odin found himself reluctant to explain. How do you describe the taste of starlight to someone who has never drunk from the well of wisdom? How do you explain that sometimes you have to lose something to truly understand its value? Instead, he simply said, "I see more clearly now than I ever did before," and it was true. The missing eye had become a different kind of sight, an inner vision that revealed truths hidden beneath the surface of things. He had paid a price that seemed enormous, but received something that was priceless, the ability to see not just what was in front of him, but what it all meant. In the days that followed, Odin would often catch himself reaching up to touch the space where his eye had been, not from regret, but from a kind of wonder. The sacrifice had marked him forever, changed him from a god who ruled through strength to one who led through wisdom, and perhaps that transformation was exactly what the Nine Realms needed. A leader who understood the true cost of the choices he made. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, consider this: what is it that you truly see when you look at the world around you, and what would you be willing to sacrifice to understand it more deeply? The old god's choice echoes across the centuries, reminding us that the most valuable things in life often require us to give up something precious in return, but perhaps that's what makes wisdom so rare, and so worth seeking. That ancient guardian we just met beside his well, Mimir, had a story that stretched back to the very beginning of things, long before Odin ever came seeking wisdom. Picture someone who has lived so long that he remembers when the world was young, when the first gods were still figuring out how to be divine, and when knowledge itself was wilder and more dangerous than it would later become. Mimir wasn't always bound to the well. Once, he had walked freely between the realms, a being of such vast intelligence that both gods and giants sought his counsel. He was tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of starlight, and hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that even small actions could have enormous consequences. When he spoke, people listened, not because his voice was loud, but because his words carried the weight of genuine understanding. His name meant memory in the old tongue, and that was fitting. Memory didn't just remember things that had happened, he remembered things that could happen, might happen, or should never be allowed to happen. His mind was like a vast library where all the books were written in languages of possibility and consequence. When you looked into his eyes, you got the unsettling feeling that he was reading not just your thoughts but the story of your entire life, including chapters you hadn't written yet. The well that would become his eternal home started as something much simpler, just a spring that bubbled up from deep underground, where one of Yggdrasil's great roots drank from the hidden waters of the earth. But Mimir saw something in that spring that others missed. He noticed how the water seemed to whisper as it flowed, how it reflected not just images but truths, how drinking from it left him with thoughts that felt both ancient and urgently new. So he began to visit the spring regularly, bringing with him scrolls and tablets, artifacts and memories, all the accumulated wisdom he had gathered in his long travels. He would sit beside the water for hours, sometimes days, slowly adding his knowledge to the spring's natural magic. It was patient work, the kind of task that requires someone who thinks in centuries rather than seasons. Gradually, something remarkable happened. The spring began to change, its waters growing clearer and deeper, taking on a quality that made them almost seem alive. Mimir found that when he meditated beside the water, he could sense the thoughts and dreams of beings across all 9 realms. He could feel the slow, deep contemplations of mountains, the quick, bright flickers of mortal minds, the vast, complicated thoughts of other gods as they went about their divine business. The transformation wasn't just happening to the spring. Mimir felt it in himself as well. A gradual merging with the waters, a slow dissolving of the boundaries between his consciousness and the growing reservoir of wisdom. It wasn't frightening, exactly, but it was irreversible. Each day he spent beside the well, he became a little less separate from it, a little more part of the eternal flow of knowledge itself. Other beings began to notice the change. Gods would arrive seeking answers to problems that had been troubling them for years, and Mimir would listen with infinite patience before offering insights that cut straight to the heart of their dilemmas. Giants came with questions about the deep magics that moved beneath the surface of the world. Even mortals occasionally found their way to the well, guided by dreams or visions, or simply the kind of desperate need that can overcome any obstacle. Mimir welcomed them all equally. To him, knowledge wasn't something to be hoarded or traded for political advantage. It was something that wanted to flow to find where it was needed most urgently. But he also understood that wisdom without cost was wisdom that wouldn't be valued or properly used. So he began asking for prices, not out of greed, but out of understanding. A sacrifice made knowledge stick in the mind, made it part of the seeker, rather than just information they carried. The prices he asked were never arbitrary. For some visitors, he requested memories, not taking them away, but asking people to share their most treasured recollections so they could become part of the well's growing consciousness. Others, he asked to spend time in service, helping to tend the sacred grove around the spring, or carrying messages to distant realms. The prices were always fair, always meaningful, always somehow exactly what the seeker needed to give in order to truly receive what they sought. As the ages passed, Mimir became more intimately connected with his well. His physical form grew translucent, like moonlight on water, and his voice began to carry echoes of underground streams and deep caves. He could still leave the well when necessary, but he found himself less and less inclined to do so. Everything he needed to know came to him through the water's vast network of connections, flowing up from the roots of the world tree like liquid understanding. The well itself grew in power and reputation. Its waters reflected not just the faces of those who peered into them, but their true natures, their hidden desires, their secret fears. The knowledge contained in those depths became legendary. Scholars spoke of it in whispers, kings dreamed of it, and wise women included it in their most sacred songs. It was said that a single sip could answer any question, solve any riddle, reveal any truth. But it was also said that the price for such knowledge was always exactly what the seeker could least afford to lose. Mimir found a strange peace in his role as guardian. There was something deeply satisfying about helping others find the understanding they needed, about being the bridge between questions and answers. He watched civilizations rise and fall, saw patterns repeat across generations, observed the slow dance of cause and effect that shaped the destiny of all 9 realms. And through it all, he accumulated wisdom, like a tree accumulates rings, slowly, steadily, each piece of knowledge adding to the whole. The loneliness that might have driven another being to madness never seemed to touch him. The well connected him to everything. Every drop of water in every realm, every tear shed in sorrow or joy, every stream that carried the hopes and dreams of those who cast wishes into moving water. He was alone and yet surrounded, isolated and yet intimately connected to the flow of life itself. When visitors approached his well, Mimir could sense them coming long before they arrived. He felt their need like a weight in the water, their questions like ripples moving through the depths. By the time they reached the spring's edge, he already knew what they would ask, and what price would be required, not because he could see the future exactly, but because he had learned to read the deep patterns that connected all things. And so he waited by his well, patient as stone, constant as flowing water, wise as the accumulated experience of ages. He had become something more than god or giant. He had become knowledge itself, given consciousness and form. The well was his body, the water was his blood, and the wisdom flowing through both was his soul. It was a strange existence, but it was also exactly what the world needed, a source of understanding that would endure as long as anyone was brave enough to seek it. Tonight, as you drift toward dreams, imagine what it would be like to be the keeper of all knowledge, the one who holds answers to questions not yet asked. What would it feel like to see the connections between all things, to understand the why behind every what? And if you could ask Mimir one question, knowing the answer would cost you something precious, what would you want to know? If these gentle stories are helping you unwind, consider subscribing for more peaceful journeys through ancient myths and quiet history. Your support helps us continue bringing these calming tales to late-night listeners around the world. After learning about Mimir's patient guardianship of the well, you might wonder about the exact moment when Odin first tasted those wisdom-laden waters. The actual drinking, that single transformative sip, was both simpler and more profound than you might expect. It lasted only seconds, but its effects would ripple through eternity. Picture the scene again. Odin standing beside the well, his empty eye socket still throbbing with fresh pain, watching his sacrifice disappear into the depths. The eye didn't just sink, it seemed to dissolve, becoming part of the water itself, adding its unique perspective to the vast reservoir of knowledge. As it merged with the well's wisdom, something in the water's surface changed, becoming more reflective, more aware. Mimir moved with the slow grace of someone who had performed this ritual only a handful of times in the long history of the world. He knelt beside the well's edge, his form shifting between solid flesh and flowing water, and cupped his hands beneath the surface. The water he gathered looked ordinary enough, clear and cool, with tiny bubbles rising through it like captured stars. But Odin could sense something else, a weight that had nothing to do with its physical properties. The cup that Mimir formed with his hands seemed to hold more than water. It held memories of every conversation ever whispered beside a stream, every prayer offered to flowing rivers, every tear that had fallen into moving water, and carried away someone's deepest pain. It held the dreams of sleeping fish, and the patient thoughts of stones worn smooth by countless years of gentle current. It held the first words ever spoken, and the last words yet to be said. Odin hesitated for just a moment before drinking. Not from fear, but from recognition of the magnitude of what was about to happen. He was about to swallow wisdom itself, to take into his body knowledge that had been accumulating since the beginning of time. It would change him in ways he couldn't fully understand, make him responsible for truths he might wish he didn't know. But the hesitation passed quickly. The pain in his missing eye was already transforming into something else, a different kind of awareness, like a new sense he was still learning to use. He leaned forward and drank from Mimir's cupped hands, taking the water into himself in one long, careful swallow. The first sensation was coolness, the simple, pleasant feeling of clear water, soothing a dry throat. But almost immediately, other sensations followed. The water seemed to spread through his body like liquid light, carrying with it flavors and textures that belonged to no earthly substance. It tasted like the moment just before dawn, like the space between musical notes, like the pause between one breath and the next. Then came the knowledge itself, flowing into his consciousness like a river meeting the sea. But it wasn't the overwhelming flood you might expect. Instead, it was more like waking up slowly on a summer morning, becoming gradually aware of layers of understanding that had always been there, waiting for him to notice them. The wisdom didn't crash into his mind. It bloomed there, unfolding naturally like a flower opening to sunlight. Odin began to see connections he had never noticed before. The way a raven's flight pattern echoed the movements of fate itself, how the growth of a tree mirrored the development of wisdom in a thoughtful mind. The relationship between the tides in distant Midgard oceans and the ebb and flow of divine power in Asgard's halls. Everything was connected to everything else in ways that were both obvious and invisible. He understood, with crystalline clarity, why Mimir had asked for his eye as payment. It wasn't cruelty or arbitrary tradition, it was necessity. Physical sight, the kind that depends on light entering the eye and creating images in the brain, could actually interfere with the deeper sight that wisdom provided. By sacrificing one kind of vision, he had opened himself to another kind entirely. The knowledge kept flowing, but gently, like honey poured slowly from a jar. He saw the past not as a series of events, but as a living pattern that continued to shape the present. He saw the future not as a fixed destination but as a garden of possibilities, some more likely than others, all dependent on the choices made by conscious beings in each unfolding moment. Most remarkably, he began to understand the true nature of sacrifice itself. It wasn't about loss, it was about transformation. When you gave up something precious for something even more valuable, you didn't become less than you were before. You became different, changed in ways that made you more capable of handling whatever came next. His missing eye wasn't gone. It had been transformed into something more useful than sight alone could ever be. The pain in his socket continued to fade, replaced by a sensation he couldn't quite name. It felt like a warm wind blowing through a space that had never existed before, carrying messages from parts of reality he was just beginning to explore. The empty socket had become a different kind of organ, one that perceived truth rather than light, wisdom rather than images. As the immediate effects of drinking from the well began to settle, Odin found himself looking at Mimir with new understanding. The Guardian wasn't separate from the well. He was part of it, had chosen to merge his consciousness with the flowing wisdom in an act of service that spanned countless ages. His patient guardianship wasn't a burden but a calling, a way of ensuring that knowledge would be available to those brave enough to pay its price. Mimir smiled, and in that smile Odin saw recognition and approval. The ancient Guardian had watched many seekers approach his well, but few had paid the full price required for true wisdom. Most offered gold or promises, trying to negotiate their way to understanding without genuine sacrifice. But Odin had understood instinctively what the well demanded, not external wealth, but an internal transformation that could only come through real loss. The drink itself was finished in moments, but its effects would continue unfolding for the rest of Odin's existence. He would discover new layers of the wisdom he had gained, find applications for insights that initially seemed abstract, learn to use his transformed vision to guide and protect those under his care. The water had become part of him, and he had become part of the vast network of understanding that flowed through all 9 realms. As he prepared to leave the well, Odin felt a deep gratitude, not just for the wisdom he had received, but for the opportunity to pay its true price. The sacrifice had marked him, changed him, made him into someone capable of bearing the weight of genuine understanding. He was no longer the same god who had approached the well with 2 eyes and a simple desire for knowledge. He had become something more complex and more capable, a ruler who understood the true cost of every decision. The single drink had lasted only seconds, but it had altered the course of destiny itself. Every choice Odin would make from that moment forward would be informed by the wisdom flowing through him. Every word he spoke would carry the weight of genuine understanding. He had paid the price willingly, and in return he had received something beyond value, the ability to see clearly into the heart of things. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, consider what you might be willing to sacrifice for true understanding. What price would you pay for the ability to see clearly into the nature of your own life, your relationships, your purpose? The old stories remind us that the most valuable things always cost us something precious, but perhaps that's exactly what makes them worth having. Some moments change everything that comes after, creating a clear division between who you were before and who you became after. For Odin, that moment came on a day that began like any other in Asgard, with golden sunlight streaming across the rainbow bridge and the sound of his ravens calling from their perches high above his hall. You might imagine that such a momentous decision would be preceded by signs and portents, by weeks of agonized deliberation or divine dreams pointing the way forward. But the morning when Odin finally decided to seek Mimir's well was startlingly ordinary. He woke in his bed, ate his breakfast of bread and honey, spoke with his advisors about the usual concerns of governing a realm full of gods, and felt the familiar weight of responsibilities he couldn't quite fulfill with his current understanding. The decision came to him quietly, the way the most important realizations often do. He was standing on his balcony, looking out over the vast expanse of Asgard, when he realized that all his power and authority meant nothing if he lacked the wisdom to use them properly. He could see everything his divine vision could reach, but he couldn't see what it all meant, couldn't read the deeper patterns that would help him protect his people from the troubles he sensed approaching. So he prepared for the journey with the same methodical care he brought to any important task. He chose simple traveling clothes instead of his ceremonial robes, selecting garments that would be comfortable for a long walk and wouldn't mark him immediately as the All-Father of the gods. He decided to go alone, without his usual retinue of warriors or his 8-legged horse Sleipnir. This was a personal quest, something that required solitude and contemplation. The path to Mimir's well led through some of the most ancient parts of Yggdrasil's domain, where the great tree's roots had grown so massive, they formed tunnels and caverns large enough for gods to walk through. The air there was thick with age and mystery, filled with the whispers of leaves far overhead, and the distant sound of water flowing through hidden channels. Every step took Odin further from the familiar territories of divine politics, and closer to something more fundamental. As he walked, Odin found himself thinking about sight and blindness, about the difference between looking and seeing. He had always prided himself on his keen vision, his ability to spot details that others missed, to see across vast distances and perceive threats long before they became critical. But increasingly, he had begun to suspect that his reliance on physical sight might actually be limiting him, preventing him from developing other ways of understanding the world. The landscape around the well was different from anywhere else in the Nine Realms. Plants grew in patterns that seemed almost intentional, as if they were arranging themselves according to some cosmic blueprint only they could perceive. The light filtered through leaves in ways that created shifting patterns on the ground, symbols that appeared and disappeared as clouds moved across the sky far above. Even the stones seemed placed with purpose, forming spirals and circles that drew the eye inward toward the well at the center of it all. When Odin finally saw the well itself, his first thought was how small it looked for something with such an enormous reputation. It was just a circular pool, perhaps 10 feet across, surrounded by stones worn smooth by countless ages of weather and time. But as he approached, he began to sense the power contained within those still waters, the accumulated wisdom of ages flowing in depths that seemed to extend far beyond what the physical dimensions could possibly contain. Mimir emerged from the water as Odin approached, rising slowly like a thought becoming conscious. The ancient guardian looked exactly as Odin had expected, and completely different at the same time, familiar from countless descriptions, but possessing a presence that no words could adequately capture. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire universes of understanding, and when he smiled in greeting, it was with the warmth of someone welcoming an old friend. They spoke for a long time before the subject of payment arose. Mimir was genuinely curious about the affairs of Asgard, about the challenges Odin faced as a leader, about the weight of trying to guide other gods who were often more interested in their own concerns than in the greater good. In return, Odin asked about the well, about the nature of the wisdom it contained, about what it meant to be the guardian of such profound knowledge. It was during this conversation that Odin truly understood what he would need to sacrifice. Mimir explained it gently, without any trace of cruelty or satisfaction in the price he named. The well required a sacrifice of sight in order to grant true vision. Physical eyes could perceive only surfaces, only the immediate and obvious. To see deeply into the nature of things required a different kind of organ altogether. The actual moment of sacrifice came with surprising suddenness. 1 second Odin was considering the price, weighing the value of what he might gain against the cost of what he would lose. The next second, he was reaching up toward his right eye, his fingers steady and sure. There was no dramatic pause, no final hesitation, just the swift, decisive action of someone who had made up his mind completely. The pain was immediate and intense, but also strangely clean. It hurt the way touching a hot coal hurts, sharply and completely, without any ambiguity or complexity. But underneath the pain was something else, a sense of rightness, of a necessary step being taken towards something much more important than comfort or convenience. As his eye fell into the well's depths, Odin watched it sink through the clear water until it disappeared into darkness far below. But he also felt something remarkable happening to the space where his eye had been. Instead of simply feeling empty, the socket was becoming something new, a different kind of sense organ, one designed to perceive truth rather than light. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. As Mimir offered him the cup of wisdom water, Odin was still adjusting to the strange new sensations coming from his wounded face. But when he drank, everything suddenly made sense. The pain transformed into awareness, the loss became a gain, and the sacrifice revealed itself as the beginning of something much larger than he had imagined. The journey back to Asgard was long and contemplative. Odin moved slowly, learning to navigate with his changed vision, discovering how much more he could perceive with one physical eye, and one eye that saw deeper truths. Colors seemed more meaningful, shadows held information about the things that cast them, and the connections between all living things became visible as golden threads stretching across the cosmos. When he finally returned to his halls, the other gods immediately noticed the change. Not just the obvious physical alteration, but something more fundamental, a quality of attention, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. When Odin looked at them now, they felt seen in a way that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. as if he could perceive not just their actions but their motivations, their fears, their hidden dreams. The day that had begun so ordinarily had ended with a transformation that would affect every day that followed. Odin had traded a part of himself for the ability to see more clearly into the heart of things, and in doing so, he had become the kind of leader his people truly needed, one who understood the real cost of every choice, the deep connections between all things, and the wisdom that comes only through genuine sacrifice. As you settle into sleep tonight, think about the moments in your own life that created clear divisions between before and after. What have you learned through sacrifice, through choosing the difficult path that led to deeper understanding? Sometimes the most ordinary days contain the most extraordinary transformations, waiting for us to be brave enough to reach for them. The wisdom that flowed through Mimir's well wasn't just abstract knowledge floating in mystical water. Each drop contained specific secrets, real information about the nature of existence, the hidden connections between things, and the patterns that shaped the destiny of all 9 realms. Tonight, let's explore what those waters actually held, what truths were dissolved in their depths like salt in the sea. Imagine the well as a vast library, but instead of books arranged on shelves, the knowledge flows freely through liquid that moves and mixes and changes with each new contribution. Every being who had ever made a sacrifice to those waters had added their understanding to the collective wisdom, creating a reservoir of insight that grew more complex and more valuable with each passing age. The deepest secrets, the ones that had been there since the well's beginning, were the fundamental truths about how reality itself worked. The water held knowledge of the forces that held the world tree upright, that kept the 9 realms in their proper relationships to each other, that maintained the delicate balance between order and chaos that allowed life to flourish. These weren't the kind of facts you could write down in a book, but living understandings that had to be experienced to be truly grasped. Flowing just above those foundational truths were the secrets of time itself. How past, present, and future were actually connected. Why some events seemed inevitable, while others remained fluid and changeable, and the way that conscious choices rippled both forward and backward through the stream of existence. The water knew which moments were crucial turning points, and which were merely the playing out of decisions already made. It understood why some actions had consequences that lasted for generations while others faded almost immediately. The well also contained intimate knowledge of every thinking being in all the realms, not their private thoughts that would have been mere gossip, but deeper insights into their true natures, their hidden potentials, their secret fears and unacknowledged dreams. The water knew which gods were struggling with doubts they could never voice, which mortals carried wisdom that even they didn't recognize, which giants harbored unexpected kindness beneath their fierce exteriors. Mixed throughout these personal insights were the secrets of relationships, how beings affected each other in ways they rarely understood, why some partnerships flourished while others withered, and the invisible threads of influence that connected parents to children, teachers to students, friends to friends across vast distances and long years. The well understood love not as an emotion, but as a force of nature, as real and measurable as gravity or magnetism. The waters held practical knowledge too, though it was often disguised as something more philosophical. They knew which crops would grow best in which soils, which herbs could heal specific ailments, which words would comfort a grieving heart, and which actions would build trust between former enemies. But this practical wisdom came wrapped in deeper understanding about why these things worked, how they connected to larger patterns of cause and effect. Some of the well's most precious secrets concern the nature of sacrifice itself, why giving up something valuable could lead to receiving something even more precious, how loss could become a form of gain, and why the most important transformations always required some kind of meaningful payment. The water understood that sacrifice wasn't just about paying a price, but about demonstrating readiness to handle whatever came next. The well also contained knowledge about the future, but not in the way most people imagined prophecy worked. Instead of fixed predictions, the water held understanding of patterns and possibilities, of the natural consequences that would likely flow from current actions and choices. It could show multiple potential futures, each one dependent on decisions that had not yet been made, revealing how even small choices could redirect the entire flow of events. One of the most surprising categories of secrets involved the hidden connections between seemingly separate things. The water knew how a song sung in Midgard could influence the growth of plants in Alfheim, how a giant's dream could affect the tides in distant oceans, how a god's moment of doubt could ripple outward to touch the lives of mortals who had never heard that deity's name. Everything was connected to everything else in ways that were both subtle and profound. The well held memories of the very beginning of things, not just the creation of the current world, but the patterns that had existed before any worlds at all, the fundamental principles that had guided the emergence of consciousness and order from primordial chaos. These ancient memories were like seeds of wisdom that could grow into understanding of almost any contemporary problem or question. Among the most complex secrets were those dealing with the nature of power itself, how real authority differed from mere force, why some rulers inspired genuine loyalty, while others commanded only fear, and the way that true leadership required a kind of wisdom that could only be gained through genuine humility. The water understood that the most effective power was often the kind that remained invisible, working through influence and example rather than command and control. The well also contained knowledge about the relationship between individual choice and larger destiny. It understood how personal decisions fitted into cosmic patterns, why some people seemed to have more freedom than others, and how even the most constrained circumstances contained opportunities for meaningful choice. This was wisdom that could help anyone navigate the tension between accepting what couldn't be changed and taking responsibility for what could be influenced. Perhaps most remarkably, the waters held secrets about their own nature, knowledge about knowledge itself, understanding about the process of understanding, wisdom about the acquisition and use of wisdom. They knew why some truths had to be earned through experience rather than simply explained in words, why the most valuable insights were often the ones that initially seemed most difficult to accept. As Odin drank from those waters, all of these secrets became available to him, not as an overwhelming flood of information, but as a living resource he could draw upon as needed. The wisdom didn't crowd his mind with facts, but expanded his ability to perceive the deeper patterns in whatever situation he encountered. He had gained access to a flowing library of understanding that would continue to reveal new insights for the rest of his existence. Tonight, as you rest, consider what secrets might be flowing through the quiet moments of your own life. What patterns are you beginning to notice? What connections are becoming visible that you never saw before? Sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from dramatic revelations but from patient attention to the subtle currents of understanding that flow just beneath the surface of everyday experience. These gentle explorations of ancient wisdom are meant to accompany you into peaceful rest. If you're finding comfort in these stories, a subscription helps us continue sharing these quiet journeys with fellow seekers of restful content. The wisdom Odin gained from Mimir's well was vast and transformative, but it was still just the beginning of his quest for deeper understanding. You see, there were other kinds of knowledge in the cosmos, older, more fundamental ways of comprehending the forces that shaped reality itself. And Odin, now seeing with his combination of physical sight and inner vision, began to perceive symbols that seemed to flicker at the edges of his awareness, ancient marks that held meanings he couldn't quite grasp. These were the runes, the primal letters that spelled out the very laws of existence. They weren't just an alphabet for writing words, but a system of symbols that described the deepest patterns underlying all of reality. Each rune was like a key that could unlock specific aspects of cosmic truth, but the knowledge of how to read them had been lost for ages, hidden away where only the most determined seeker could hope to find it. Odin began to see traces of runic symbols everywhere once he knew to look for them. They appeared in the way frost formed on windows, in the patterns that lightning carved across stormy skies, in the arrangement of stars on the clearest nights. The symbols seemed to be trying to communicate something urgently important, but remained tantalizingly beyond his ability to understand. It was like hearing someone speak in a language that almost made sense, where you could catch the emotional tone, but none of the actual meaning. His search for understanding led him eventually to Yggdrasil itself, the great world tree that connected all 9 realms. Standing at its base, craning his neck to peer up into branches that disappeared into distances beyond even divine sight, Odin began to suspect that the tree itself might hold the key to runic wisdom. The bark's natural patterns seemed to echo the symbols he had been glimpsing, and there was something about the tree's patient, enduring presence that suggested it had been watching and remembering since the very beginning of things. The realization of what he would need to do came to him gradually, like the slow dawn of an unwelcome but undeniable truth. The runes wouldn't reveal themselves to casual observation or intellectual study. They were too fundamental, too powerful to be learned through ordinary methods. Like the wisdom of Mimir's well, they required a genuine sacrifice, not of something external like gold or silver, but of something essential to his very nature as a living being. Odin understood that he would need to hang himself from the world tree, to suspend himself between life and death for however long it took to pierce the veil that separated ordinary consciousness from the deeper truths the runes represented. It would be a sacrifice of comfort, of safety, of the normal functioning of his divine body. He would have to give up everything that made existence pleasant or easy in order to achieve a state of awareness that might allow him to perceive what had been hidden. The preparation for this ordeal was both simple and complex. Physically, all he needed was a strong rope and the courage to use it, but mentally and spiritually, he had to prepare himself for an experience that would push him to the very limits of what even a god could endure. He spent days in meditation, emptying his mind of distractions, focusing his will on the single goal of achieving understanding no matter what the cost. When the time finally came, Odin chose a branch that hung high above the ground, strong enough to support his weight, but positioned so that he would sway with every movement of the great tree. He fashioned a noose from rope that had been blessed by the most skilled craftsman in Asgard, then consecrated with his own divine power. This wasn't going to be a quick death and resurrection. It was going to be a prolonged suspension between states of being, a deliberate journey into the borderland between life and whatever lay beyond. The first hours of hanging were the most difficult to endure. His body, accustomed to comfort and strength, rebelled against the unnatural position, the gradual restriction of breath, the slow but steady depletion of energy. Pain flowed through him in waves. Not the sharp, clean pain of his eye sacrifice, but a dull, persistent ache that seemed to seep into every part of his being. His divine nature kept him alive, but it couldn't spare him from feeling every moment of the ordeal. By the second day, the physical discomfort had evolved into something stranger and more complex. Odin found his consciousness beginning to shift, to operate according to different rules than normal waking awareness. The boundaries between his thoughts and the world around him became blurred. He could feel the slow pulse of the world tree's vast life force, the patient circulation of sap through branches that stretched across cosmic distances, the gentle breathing of leaves that filtered light from distant stars. On the third day, hunger and thirst joined the symphony of discomfort. His mouth became dry as ancient parchment, his stomach empty as a cave. But even these sensations began to take on symbolic meaning, becoming part of a larger pattern he was slowly learning to read. Hunger became a rune meaning desire and need. Thirst transformed into a symbol representing the longing for knowledge. Pain itself became a letter in an alphabet of experience. The fourth day brought visions that seemed more real than ordinary reality. Odin saw the history of the cosmos unfold like a vast scroll, watched the first gods learn to shape matter with their will, observed the slow development of consciousness in beings throughout all 9 realms. But even more significantly, he began to see the runic symbols that had been hiding beneath the surface of these events, the fundamental patterns that had been guiding the flow of existence since the very beginning. By the 5th day, the distinction between Odin and the tree had begun to dissolve. He felt his consciousness spreading through the vast network of roots and branches, sharing the tree's ancient patience, its deep understanding of cycles and seasons, and the slow rhythm of cosmic time. In this expanded state of awareness, the runes became more visible, appearing like constellations of meaning scattered throughout the structure of reality itself. The 6th day brought a different kind of trial. As Odin's physical body weakened further, his expanded consciousness had to work harder to maintain its coherence. There were moments when he nearly lost himself entirely, when his awareness threatened to scatter like leaves in a storm. But each time he managed to pull himself back together, he found that his understanding of the runic patterns had deepened, as if the struggle itself was teaching him something essential about the nature of meaning and consciousness. On the 7th day, something shifted. The runes stopped being external symbols he was trying to perceive and became internal experiences he was living. Each symbol revealed itself not as a mark to be read, but as a state of being to be embodied. He didn't just see the rune for strength, he became strength itself, understanding it from the inside out. He didn't merely observe the rune for wisdom, he experienced the essence of what wisdom actually was. The 8th day brought synthesis. All the individual runes began to connect with each other, forming a vast network of meaning that described the complete structure of existence. Odin could see how each symbol related to all the others, how they combined and interacted to create the complex patterns that governed everything from the growth of a single flower to the destiny of entire realms. The runic system revealed itself as a kind of cosmic grammar, the underlying language that reality used to describe itself to itself. On the 9th day, Odin experienced a moment of perfect clarity. The rope, his body, the tree, the cosmos, and his own consciousness all became part of a single unified pattern that he could read like a book written in letters of light. In that moment, he understood not just the individual runes, but the principles that governed how they could be combined, modified, and used to influence the flow of events. He had gained not just knowledge, but the ability to use that knowledge creatively and responsibly. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ordeal was over. Odin found himself back in his physical body, still hanging from the tree, but now fully capable of freeing himself. His divine strength returned in a rush, and he lowered himself to the ground with hands that still shook from 9 days of strain. But the weakness in his body was nothing compared to the strength in his mind, where 24 runic symbols now blazed with perfect clarity, each one a tool for understanding and shaping reality itself. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider what you might learn if you were willing to suspend yourself between your current understanding and whatever truths lie just beyond your reach. What symbols are trying to communicate with you at the edges of your awareness? Sometimes the most valuable knowledge requires us to let go of everything familiar and comfortable, to hang suspended in uncertainty, until new patterns of meaning finally reveal themselves. The 9 days and nights that Odin spent hanging from Yggdrasil were more than just an ordeal to be endured. They were a journey through different states of consciousness, each one revealing new aspects of the runic wisdom he sought. Let's walk through those 9 nights together, experiencing the slow transformation that changed the All-Father from a seeker of knowledge into a master of the cosmic alphabet itself. The first night was the hardest in some ways, because Odin still expected his normal patterns of thought and sensation to continue functioning. As darkness fell around the world tree, he found himself acutely aware of every small discomfort, the rope's pressure against his throat, the gradually increasing ache in his shoulders and arms, the way his divine robes twisted and pulled in directions they were never designed to accommodate. Sleep, which usually came easily to gods, remained frustratingly elusive. Instead, he hung in a state of tired alertness, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead through the canopy of world-spanning branches. The second night brought a different quality of awareness. The initial shock of discomfort had faded into a steady background sensation that he was learning to accept rather than fight. More importantly, his perception began to change. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried further, and he started to notice details of the tree's life that had been invisible during normal consciousness. He could feel the slow circulation of sap through the massive trunk, sense the patient respiration of leaves far above, even perceive the gentle conversations that root systems carried on with underground streams and buried stones. By the third night, Odin's relationship with pain had transformed entirely. What had initially felt like suffering now seemed more like information, his body's way of describing its current state in a language of sensation he was just learning to understand. The ache in his muscles became a teacher, showing him the difference between necessary discomfort and pointless struggle. The gradual weakening of his physical strength revealed how much energy he normally wasted on maintaining unnecessary tensions and resistances. The fourth night was when the first genuine visions began. As Odin hung in the space between waking and sleeping, between comfort and ordeal, his consciousness started to operate according to different rules. He began to see events that were happening in other parts of the 9 realms, not through any ordinary sight, but through a kind of awareness that seemed to flow through the world tree's vast network of connections. He watched giants dreaming in their mountain halls, observed mortals tending their fires in distant Midgard, saw his fellow gods going about their business in golden Asgard, all unaware of his suspended vigil. The fifth night brought deeper visions, ones that moved beyond the present moment into other times entirely. Odin found himself witnessing events from the distant past, the first shaping of the worlds, the early wars between gods and giants, the slow development of consciousness in various forms of life throughout the cosmos. But even more remarkably, he began to perceive the underlying patterns that connected these historical moments, the threads of cause and effect that wove through time like golden filaments in a vast tapestry. On the sixth night, the boundary between Odin's individual consciousness and the larger awareness of the world tree began to blur in earnest. He felt his sense of self expanding, stretching to encompass not just his own thoughts and experiences, but the accumulated wisdom of the ancient tree itself. This was both exhilarating and terrifying, losing the familiar boundaries of individual identity while gaining access to forms of understanding that no single mind could normally contain. He had to learn to be himself while also being part of something infinitely larger. The seventh night was when the runes themselves began to appear, not as symbols to be observed but as living realities to be experienced. They emerged from the patterns of starlight, filtering through leaves, from the rhythm of wind moving through branches, from the deep pulse of the tree's life force itself. But they weren't static images, they were dynamic principles, each one describing a fundamental aspect of how existence organized and expressed itself. Odin didn't just see the rune that meant strength, he became strength itself, understanding it from the inside as a cosmic principle, rather than just a concept. The eighth night brought the revelation of how the individual runes related to each other, forming a complex system of meaning that described the complete structure of reality. Odin could see how they combined and interacted, how certain combinations created specific effects, how the entire runic alphabet functioned as a kind of cosmic operating system that governed everything from the growth of plants to the movements of planets. The knowledge was so vast and intricate that it would take lifetimes to fully explore all its implications, but the basic framework was now clear and accessible. On the ninth and final night, everything came together in a moment of perfect integration. Odin experienced a state of consciousness that was simultaneously individual and universal, mortal and divine, limited and infinite. In that moment, he understood not just the runes themselves, but the principles that had created them, the cosmic intelligence that had embedded these patterns of meaning into the very structure of existence. He became, for that brief, eternal instant, one with the source of all knowledge, all wisdom, all understanding. Then, as the first light of the 10th day began to filter through the world tree's leaves, Odin felt his consciousness settling back into its normal boundaries. But it was a transformed consciousness, one that now contained the full knowledge of the runic system. 24 symbols blazed in his mind with perfect clarity, each one a key to understanding and influencing specific aspects of reality. He had gained not just information but wisdom, the knowledge of how to use these cosmic tools responsibly and effectively. The process of returning to normal awareness was gradual and careful. Odin had to relearn how to inhabit his physical body, how to think individual thoughts, how to perceive the world through the familiar boundaries of divine consciousness. But the runic knowledge remained accessible, integrated into his being in such a fundamental way that it felt like a natural extension of his other senses. He could read the runic patterns underlying any situation, understand the deeper forces at work in any event, and when necessary use his understanding to influence the flow of circumstances. As he finally lowered himself from the tree, Odin was profoundly aware of how much he had changed. The sacrifice of comfort, safety, and normal consciousness had transformed him into something new, not just a god who happened to know about runes, but a being who embodied runic wisdom in every aspect of his existence. The 9 nights of hanging had been more than an ordeal to be endured. They had been a process of becoming someone capable of handling the cosmic responsibility that came with such profound knowledge. The return journey to Asgard was slow and contemplative. Odin moved carefully, still adjusting to the way his transformed consciousness interacted with his physical form, learning to see the runic patterns that were now visible everywhere he looked. Every step revealed new layers of meaning, new applications for the wisdom he had gained. The sacrifice had ended, but the real work of integration and understanding was just beginning. Tonight, as you settle into rest, think about the patient endurance required for any genuine transformation. What aspects of yourself might you need to suspend or sacrifice temporarily in order to discover new ways of understanding your life? Sometimes the most valuable changes come not through dramatic action, but through patient willingness to hang suspended between who you've been and who you might become, waiting for new patterns of meaning to finally reveal themselves. With his newly acquired runic wisdom, and the deep understanding gained from Mimir's well, Odin found himself facing a different kind of challenge. He possessed vast knowledge, and the ability to perceive cosmic patterns, but he was still only one consciousness in one location at one time. How could he possibly keep track of everything happening across all 9 realms? How could he gather the information he needed to use his wisdom effectively? The answer came to him in the form of 2 remarkable birds, who would become his most trusted companions. Huginn and Muninn weren't ordinary ravens, though they began their existence much like any other members of their clever, curious species. They had lived in the great tree Yggdrasil for centuries, building their nests in the high branches and raising generations of young among the cosmic leaves. What made them special was their extraordinary intelligence and their natural affinity for the kinds of knowledge that most interested Odin, the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed deeper truths, the connections between seemingly unrelated events, the hidden meanings that lay beneath the surface of ordinary occurrences. Ravens have always been remarkably intelligent birds, capable of solving complex problems, remembering individual faces for years, and even teaching their young sophisticated techniques for finding food and avoiding danger. But Huginn and Muninn were exceptional, even among their remarkable species. They had spent so much time in the world tree, breathing the rarefied air of cosmic consciousness, that they had developed abilities that bordered on the divine. Huginn, whose name meant thought, specialized in perceiving the mental and emotional patterns that drove behavior across all the realms. He could sense the hopes and fears that motivated mortals, the ambitions and rivalries that shaped divine politics, the instinctive drives that governed the actions of various creatures throughout the cosmos. When Huginn looked at any situation, he saw not just what was happening but why it was happening, what psychological forces were creating the patterns of action and reaction he observed. Muninn, whose name meant memory, had developed an extraordinary ability to perceive and remember the connections between past and present events. He could see how ancient decisions continued to influence current circumstances, how forgotten promises shaped present relationships, how the accumulated weight of history created the conditions that determined what was possible in any given moment. Muninn understood that the present was never just the present, it was the flowering of countless seeds planted in earlier times. When Odin first approached the two ravens, they were initially skeptical of his proposal. They had lived free lives in the world tree, answerable to no one, traveling where they pleased and observing what interested them. Why should they bind themselves to the service of even such a wise god as the All-Father? The negotiations were delicate and required all of Odin's diplomatic skills, enhanced by his newly acquired understanding of deeper motivations and connections. What finally convinced the ravens was Odin's demonstration of how their individual abilities could be amplified and enhanced through partnership with his wisdom. Working together, they could become something greater than the sum of their parts, a distributed intelligence network capable of perceiving and analyzing patterns across vast distances and extended time periods. Huginn and Muninn would gain access to Odin's cosmic perspective, while he would benefit from their mobility and their natural talent for observation. The first experimental flights were revelatory for all three participants. Odin discovered that he could maintain a psychic connection with the ravens across enormous distances, seeing through their eyes, thinking through their remarkable minds, accessing their unique perspectives on the events they witnessed. In return, Huginn and Muninn found that their natural abilities were magnified by their connection to Odin's runic wisdom and well-earned understanding of cosmic patterns. Huginn's specialty, reading the psychological patterns underlying behavior, became extraordinarily sophisticated. When combined with Odin's knowledge of the deeper forces that shaped consciousness itself, the raven could now perceive not just what someone was thinking, but how their thoughts connected to larger patterns of fate and destiny. He could sense when someone was approaching a crucial decision point, when hidden emotions were about to surface in ways that would change the course of events. Muninn's gift for perceiving connections between past and present became equally enhanced. With access to Odin's accumulated wisdom, the raven could trace the historical threads that connected current events to their ultimate origins, sometimes reaching back through multiple generations to find the first causes of present circumstances. He became capable of seeing the long, slow patterns that shaped the destiny of entire civilizations, understanding how cultures evolved and changed over centuries of gradual development. Their daily routine, once established, became as regular and reliable as sunrise and sunset. Each morning, as the first light touched the highest branches of Yggdrasil, Huginn and Muninn would spread their black wings and launch themselves into the cosmic winds that flowed between the realms. They would spend the day traveling vast distances, observing events both momentous and mundane, gathering information that would help Odin understand the current state of his vast responsibilities. Huginn might spend his time watching the interactions between gods in Asgard's great halls, reading the subtle signs of shifting alliances and emerging conflicts. Or he might visit Midgard to observe how mortals were adapting to changing circumstances, what new ideas were taking root in human consciousness, which leaders were rising to prominence, and which were losing the confidence of their people. His reports to Odin were like psychological portraits painted in words, revealing the inner landscapes that determined outer actions. Muninn, meanwhile, specialized in investigating how current events connected to historical patterns. He might trace the origins of a current dispute back through generations of accumulated grievances, or observe how an innovation in one realm was actually the rediscovery of knowledge that had been lost and found multiple times throughout cosmic history. His reports helped Odin understand not just what was happening, but how it fitted into the larger patterns that shaped the evolution of consciousness and civilization. Each evening, as shadows lengthened across the 9 realms, the 2 ravens would return to Odin's hall. They would perch on his shoulders, Huginn on the right, Muninn on the left, and share their observations through the psychic connection they maintained. But it wasn't just a simple transfer of information. The sharing was more like a complex conversation between three highly intelligent minds, each contributing their unique perspective to create understanding that none could achieve alone. Odin would listen to their reports with the deep attention that his hard-won wisdom had taught him to cultivate. He could feel their memories becoming part of his own consciousness, their observations enriching his understanding of the complex web of relationships and forces that shaped events across all 9 realms. In return, his cosmic perspective helped the ravens understand the deeper significance of what they had witnessed, how their individual observations fitted into larger patterns of meaning and consequence. Over time, this daily exchange created a form of distributed consciousness that was unique in all the cosmos. Odin, Huginn, and Muninn became 3 aspects of a single intelligence, one that could simultaneously maintain a cosmic perspective and attend to specific details, that could think both strategically and tactically, that could perceive both the forest and the individual trees that composed it. They had created something that was greater than any of them could have achieved individually. The ravens also became valued companions, in ways that went beyond their practical utility. Their presence reminded Odin that wisdom was most valuable when it was shared, that even the most cosmic understanding benefited from being filtered through other perspectives. Huginn and Muninn helped keep him connected to the immediate world of actions and reactions, preventing him from becoming lost in abstract contemplation of ultimate truths. For their part, the ravens found deep satisfaction in their role as gatherers and interpreters of information. They had discovered a purpose that matched their natural intelligence and curiosity, that challenged them to develop their abilities in ways they never could have imagined during their simpler life in the world tree. They had become partners in the great work of understanding and wisdom, contributing their unique gifts to endeavors that spanned the entire cosmos. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, consider what companions, human or otherwise, help you see more clearly into the nature of your own life. Who are the observers who bring you information about yourself and your world? What perspectives besides your own help you understand the connections between past choices and present circumstances? Sometimes wisdom comes not from solitary contemplation, but from the patient sharing of observations with minds that see differently than we do. His first transformation was both simple and profound. Instead of his usual magnificent robes and golden ornaments, he clothed himself in the rough wool garments of a common traveler. He let his divine radiance fade to the barely perceptible glow that mortals might mistake for the natural charisma of someone who had lived an interesting life. Most importantly, he learned to modulate his cosmic awareness, allowing himself to see and think more like an ordinary being while retaining access to his deeper knowledge when absolutely necessary. Armed with runic wisdom, insight from Mimir's well, and the constant information gathering of his 2 ravens, Odin discovered that there were still truths that could only be learned through direct experience. Books and reports and even magical knowledge could tell you about the world, but they couldn't show you what it felt like to actually live in it. So the Allfather began a practice that would continue for centuries, traveling through all 9 realms in disguise, learning what life was really like for the countless beings under his protection. The idea came to him gradually, sparked partly by stories his ravens brought back from their travels. Huginn and Muninn could observe and analyze behavior, but they remained fundamentally outside the experiences they witnessed. They could see how mortals responded to hardship, but they couldn't feel what it was like to worry about finding enough food for winter or to grieve the loss of a beloved friend. Odin began to realize that his divine perspective, for all its advantages, also created a kind of distance that might be limiting his understanding. The disguise he chose became his favorite, that of a wandering philosopher and storyteller, someone old enough to have accumulated wisdom, but humble enough to still be learning from every encounter. He would appear as a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, a long cloak suitable for traveling in all weather, and a staff that looked like simple wood but was actually carved with subtle runic symbols. Most people who met him remembered him as interesting and somehow memorable, but they rarely suspected they had been speaking with a god. His travels took him first to Midgard, the realm of mortals, where he discovered that human life was both more difficult and more beautiful than he had understood from his divine perspective. He walked with farmers as they worked their fields, learning about the patient optimism required to plant seeds in ground that might or might not yield sufficient harvest. He sat with merchants around their evening fires, listening to stories of distant markets and the careful calculations required to turn a profit while still dealing fairly with customers. In the great halls of human kings, Odin observed the delicate balance between strength and wisdom that effective leadership required. He saw how the best rulers had to be simultaneously confident enough to make difficult decisions, and humble enough to listen to advice from counselors who might know more about specific subjects. He He watched young princes learning that true authority came not from the ability to command obedience, but from earning the kind of respect that made people want to follow your lead. But it was in the humbler dwellings, the farmhouses and workshops and modest town homes, that Odin learned some of his most valuable lessons about the nature of contentment and resilience. He met families who faced significant hardships with remarkable grace, who found joy in simple pleasures, who maintained hope, even when circumstances seemed overwhelmingly difficult. Their strength came not from power or knowledge, but from something more fundamental, a kind of practical wisdom that helped them focus on what they could control while accepting what they couldn't change. His travels extended beyond Midgard to the other realms, each offering different lessons about the nature of existence. In Alfheim, home of the Light Elves, he walked through forests where every leaf seemed to glow with inner light, observing beings whose entire culture was built around the pursuit of beauty and harmony. The elves taught him about the importance of aesthetic pleasure, how the appreciation of loveliness could be a form of wisdom in itself, a way of honoring the creative force that shaped all things. In Jotunheim, the realm of giants, Odin discovered that his supposed enemies were far more complex than divine politics had suggested. Many giants were scholars and philosophers, beings of immense intelligence who approached problems from perspectives that complemented rather than contradicted divine wisdom. He sat in their vast libraries, reading books written in script so large that each letter was the size of his entire hand, learning about mathematical concepts and natural phenomena that even the gods had not fully grasped. The dark elves of Svartalfheim showed him the beauty that could be found in working with one's hands, the deep satisfaction that came from creating objects of lasting value through patient craftsmanship. He spent months learning their techniques for shaping metal and stone, discovering how the process of making something beautiful could be as valuable as the finished product itself. The rhythm of hammer on anvil became a kind of meditation, each strike a prayer offered to the creative forces of the universe. In Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, Odin learned about different approaches to divinity itself. The Vanir were more closely connected to the natural cycles of growth and decay, more comfortable with the inevitable changes that time brought to all things. Their wisdom was earthier, more practical, focused on working with natural forces rather than trying to control them. They taught him about the value of patience, about trusting processes that moved too slowly to be easily observed. Even in Helheim, the realm of the dead, Odin found valuable lessons. Disguised as a wandering spirit, he walked among the departed souls and learned about the perspectives that came only after life had ended. The dead had a clarity about what had truly mattered during their living years, a wisdom about which concerns had been worth their attention and which had been mere distractions. Their insights helped him understand how to use his remaining time more effectively. But perhaps the most valuable lesson came from simply being anonymous, from interacting with beings who saw him only as another traveler with interesting stories to share. Without the deference and careful political maneuvering that surrounded his divine identity, he could observe authentic behavior, hear honest opinions, and engage in conversations that revealed truths people would never share with the All-Father of the gods. Each disguise taught him something different about the art of observation and interaction. As a farmer, he learned about the deep satisfaction of work that produced something necessary for survival. As a merchant, he discovered the complex ethics of fair trade and the importance of reputation built over years of honest dealing. As a scholar, he experienced the pure joy of learning something new, the excitement of making connections between previously separate ideas. The accumulated wisdom from these travels enriched his understanding in ways that no amount of study or divine revelation could have achieved. He learned that effective leadership required not just cosmic perspective, but intimate familiarity with the daily realities of those being led. He discovered that the most profound truths were often found in the simplest interactions: a farmer's pride in a well-tended field, a parent's love for their children, an artisan's dedication to perfecting their craft. When Odin finally returned to his divine halls after each journey, he brought with him not just information but empathy, not just knowledge but understanding of how that knowledge needed to be applied in the real circumstances of actual lives. The disguises had transformed him from a ruler who commanded from a distance into a leader who understood intimately the hopes and fears and daily challenges of those he served. These wandering years created a feedback loop that enhanced all his other sources of wisdom. The insights from Mimir's well-gained practical applications through direct observation of how abstract truths played out in concrete situations. The runic knowledge became more useful as he learned to see the patterns it described operating in the daily lives of real beings. Even the reports from Huginn and Muninn became richer as he gained personal context for the behaviors they observed. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider what you might learn by stepping outside your usual identity and perspective. What wisdom could you gain by experiencing life from a completely different vantage point? Sometimes the most valuable insights come not from studying about life, but from living it fully, paying attention to the lessons hidden in ordinary moments and everyday encounters. The giants, he discovered, were the cosmos's great experimenters and inventors, beings whose long lives and patient natures made them ideal for pursuing projects that required centuries or even millennia to complete. Where gods might rely on their inherent powers to achieve immediate results, giants worked methodically through problems, developing tools and techniques that could accomplish remarkable things through careful application of natural principles rather than divine intervention. After centuries of wandering and learning, Odin found himself drawn repeatedly to Jotunheim, the realm of giants, though not for the reasons most gods might expect. While his divine kindred often spoke of giants as enemies to be conquered or obstacles to be overcome, Odin's disguised travels had revealed them to be something far more interesting, repositories of ancient knowledge and alternative approaches to understanding the fundamental forces of existence. Odin's first significant encounter with giant craftsmanship came during a visit to the workshop of a giant named Alvis, whose name meant all-wise. Alvis had spent the better part of 1,000 years perfecting techniques for working with metals that existed nowhere else in the 9 realms, substances so rare and difficult to obtain that even gathering enough raw material for a small project required decades of patient searching and careful extraction from deep underground veins. The giant's workshop was unlike anything in Asgard's golden halls. Instead of relying on magical forces to shape and transform materials, Alvis had developed intricate mechanical systems that could apply precise amounts of heat and pressure over extended periods. His forge operated according to principles that Odin found fascinating, not because they were magically powerful, but because they were elegantly simple, using natural forces in ways that multiplied their effectiveness far beyond what brute strength alone could accomplish. What struck Odin most powerfully was the giant's attitude toward time and patience, where gods often expected immediate results and grew frustrated with delays. Alvis spoke about his centuries-long project with the casual satisfaction of someone discussing a pleasant afternoon's work. He understood that true craftsmanship couldn't be rushed, that the most valuable creations emerged from processes that unfolded according to their own natural rhythms, rather than external deadlines. Alvis was working on a project that had occupied him for nearly 3 centuries, the creation of a spear tip that would never miss its target, not through magical compulsion, but through such perfect balance and aerodynamic design that it would naturally seek the most direct path to whatever it was thrown toward. The giant explained his work with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his perfect calling, describing the subtle mathematics of weight distribution and the complex metallurgy required to create an alloy that was both impossibly sharp and completely unbreakable. But Alvis's greatest gift to Odin wasn't the spear itself. It was the understanding of how patience and persistence could achieve results that were impossible through divine power alone. The giant had shown him that there were forms of mastery that could only be developed through sustained attention over vast periods of time, approaches to problem-solving that required thinking in terms of centuries rather than seasons. The spear tip, when finally completed, was a marvel of practical engineering disguised as simple craftsmanship. It looked like nothing more than an elegantly shaped piece of metal, but when Alvis demonstrated its capabilities, Odin watched in amazement as the weapon consistently found its mark regardless of wind conditions, distance, or the thrower's skill level. The giant had embedded centuries of accumulated knowledge about physics and metallurgy into an object that would serve its purpose flawlessly for thousands of years. This lesson led Odin to seek out other giant craftsmen and scholars, each one specializing in different aspects of the long, slow work of understanding and shaping reality. He met Wayland, a giant smith whose techniques for working with magical metals had been refined through millennia of experimentation. Unlike divine smiths who relied on inherent power to force materials into desired shapes, Wayland had learned to work with the natural properties of various substances, coaxing them into forms that enhanced rather than fought against their essential natures. From Wayland, Odin acquired not just finished objects but techniques, ways of approaching creative problems that had never occurred to divine craftsmen. He learned about the value of systematic experimentation, about keeping detailed records of what worked and what didn't, about the importance of testing ideas through multiple iterations rather than expecting immediate perfection. The giant taught Odin about the importance of understanding materials from the inside out, how different metals responded to heat and pressure, which alloys produced the most desirable combinations of strength and flexibility, how the molecular structure of various substances could be permanently altered through careful manipulation of temperature and timing. This wasn't knowledge that could be learned quickly or gained through divine insight alone. It required the kind of patient empirical observation that giants excelled at. Wayland's workshop contained tools that had been gradually perfected over thousands of years. Hammers whose weight and balance had been adjusted through countless iterations. Anvils carved from stones that had been selected for their acoustic properties as much as their hardness. Forges that had been designed to maintain precise temperatures through ingenious systems of airflow and fuel management. Each tool represented generations of accumulated learning about the relationship between craftsman, material, and desired outcome. Where Odin's runic knowledge gave him insight into cosmic principles, Jormung's work focused on translation, how to take universal truths and make them useful for individuals dealing with particular challenges. The giant had developed systems for helping farmers optimize their planting schedules based on long-term weather patterns, techniques for helping rulers make decisions that balanced immediate needs with long-term consequences, and methods for helping ordinary beings recognize and develop their own natural talents and abilities. Another giant, Mimir's cousin Jormung, specialized in what might be called applied wisdom, the art of taking abstract knowledge and finding practical applications for it in specific circumstances. Jormung had spent centuries studying the reports that flowed back to Mimir's well, analyzing patterns in the information, and developing practical techniques that various beings could use to improve their lives and solve their problems. Jormung's greatest gift to Odin was a deeper understanding of how wisdom needed to be communicated in order to be truly useful. Abstract knowledge might be perfectly accurate, but it remained merely intellectual until it was translated into forms that people could actually apply in their daily lives. The giant had learned how to present complex ideas in simple language, how to use stories and examples to make difficult concepts accessible, and how to help others develop the patience and persistence required for genuine understanding. Perhaps the most unexpected teacher was a giant named Angrboda, whose specialty was understanding the relationship between order and chaos, between the forces that maintained stability and those that drove necessary change. While gods often viewed chaos as something to be controlled or eliminated, Angrboda had spent millennia studying how creative destruction could be channeled into constructive transformation. From Angrboda, Odin learned techniques for helping individuals and communities navigate difficult transitions, methods for distinguishing between changes that should be resisted and those that should be embraced, and systems for managing the anxiety and uncertainty that inevitably accompanied significant transformations. These were skills that proved invaluable in his role as a leader responsible for guiding others through the challenges of existence. She taught Odin about the importance of allowing old systems to break down when they were no longer serving their purpose, about recognizing when apparent disasters were actually opportunities for beneficial reorganization, and about the delicate balance between maintaining necessary stability and embracing helpful change. Her insights complemented his runic knowledge perfectly, providing practical guidance for applying cosmic principles in situations where transformation was needed. Each giant teacher contributed something unique to Odin's growing understanding of how cosmic wisdom could be applied in practical situations. They taught him patience, persistence, and the value of working with natural forces rather than trying to dominate them through divine power alone. Most importantly, they showed him how the most valuable gifts were often techniques and approaches rather than finished objects, ways of thinking and working that could be applied to countless different situations. When Odin finally returned to Asgard after his extended studies with the giants, he brought with him more than just new knowledge. He brought new approaches to leadership, creation, and problem-solving that enhanced everything he had learned from other sources. The gifts from the giants weren't treasures to be hoarded, but tools to be shared, techniques that could help other gods become more effective in their own areas of responsibility. The combination of cosmic perspective from Mimir as well, symbolic understanding from the runes, practical observation from his disguised travels, and patient craftsmanship from the giants had transformed Odin into a leader whose wisdom was both profound and immediately applicable. He had learned to think in terms of both eternal principles and daily necessities, to balance divine authority with genuine humility, and to approach every challenge with the kind of patient persistence that could overcome any obstacle. As you drift toward dreams tonight, consider what gifts of knowledge and technique you might be overlooking in unexpected places. Who in your life possesses skills or understanding that could enhance your own capabilities? Sometimes the most valuable learning comes not from recognized authorities, but from patient practitioners who have spent years perfecting their craft in quiet dedication. The giants remind us that true mastery often belongs to those who have learned to work with time rather than against it, who understand that the most valuable gifts are often the ones that keep giving long after they've been received. If these stories of ancient wisdom and patient learning have brought you comfort on your journey toward rest, consider subscribing to join our community of fellow seekers who find peace in these gentle explorations of timeless truths. Your support helps us continue sharing these quiet tales with dreamers around the world.